Welcome, everyone. I'm going to do a short introduction and then we'll get right into our topic here. Presenting today is Rosie Dutt, who is a PhD in computational neuroscientist and assistant teaching professor in the Department of Neuroscience and Psychology at the University of North Carolina, where she also serves as Director of Career Development and Networking. Her teaching bridges neuroscience, data science, and education using computational and system-based approaches to help students deepen their scientific understanding and connect ideas across disciplines. Dr. Dutt is passionate about interdisciplinary teaching and learning, designing courses that integrate programming, data analysis, and systems thinking to uncover patterns in biological systems and prepare students for the evolving landscape of science and technology. She has previously taught at the University of Chicago, Hopkins University, Smith College, St. Louis University, and Washington University in St. Louis. Today, she will explore how teaching programming as a way of thinking rather than just a technical skill can help students view biology as a network of interacting systems and foster deeper systems thinking in life sciences education. And she's currently coming to us while her students are taking an exam. So we're very lucky to have her at this time right now. I'll pass it over to you, Rosie. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So, as you know, I'm Rosie, and thank you all for attending today. So, today I want to explore a simple but transformative question, and that's really how can we teach programming not just as a skill, but as a way of thinking, one that helps students see biology as a network of interacting systems. And when we think about life sciences, breakthroughs increasingly depend on our ability to connect tools and concepts across disciplines. Yet students often experience coding as a series of disconnected tasks. So my goal here today is to show you how you can turn programming into a lens for systems thinking, where code can help model the dynamics of cells, genes, and even brain networks. So before we get started, what I wanted is to get everyone to put one word in the chat, or a couple of words if you want, but one word minimum, that describes how your students feel about coding. Are they intimidated? Do you think that they're excited? Do you think that they're anxious? Or generally, what do you think the sentiment is around coding itself? So we've got a couple of things coming through. We've got daunting, we've got a comment, AI will take their jobs, intimidating, challenging. So these are quite common. When you think about coding, I myself reluctantly did an engineering PhD to learn to code, as I didn't feel like I could do it any other way. I tried to quit several times, and eventually I pushed through. But when you think about it, it feels really intimidating. And these are sentiments that students sort of reiterate several times, even within my current class. So hopefully today I can get you to think about teaching programming, not just as a skill, but as a way of thinking, really thinking about system thinking in the field itself. So by the end of today's talk, my hope is that there'll be a couple of goals for what I hope you'll take away from this session. And one of the things is to think about systems thinking in life science, not really as a concept, but as something you can actively teach and model within programming. And it's not just explicit to programming, this can be applied elsewhere. And hopefully you'll see how coding isn't just a technical skill, but it can serve as that lens for reasoning, really helping students explore how different parts of the system interacts and influences with each other. And my students, despite having their exam today, have actually given me some feedback. So I've got some data which explains how I've applied this and sort of the outcomes that they've currently experienced. So I'll also talk a bit about practical strategies, and we'll talk about the tiered challenges and a bit about interdisciplinary framing, which has helped the students move from just learning the syntax that you typically see in code to actually analyzing data and seeing what emergent behaviors have come out from not just their own learning, but applying that to the field. So I hope you can walk away with ideas for adapting these approaches to your own disciplines, whether that's neuroscience, psychology, health sciences, or beyond. So you can use programming to help students see the bigger picture, not just those individual pieces. So before I do any talk, I think it's always important to explain why does this matter? Why are we doing this? So when we talk about systems thinking, we're really talking about helping students build a kind of cognitive architecture that allows them to see science as an interconnected process, not as a list of disconnected facts or scripts or code. And when we think about research in science education, consistently is that it has actually shown that systems thinking can enhance scientific literacy by helping students reason across biological scales and integrate feedback, interaction, and emergence into their explanation. So, in simple terms, students who think in systems can actually better transfer that knowledge from the molecular to the ecological aspects or from code to biology because they are recognizing the underlying organizational principles. And if I apply this to bioinformatics or computational life science, this kind of reasoning is actually quite critical. With AI seeping into everything, informatics becomes kind of important everywhere. And in 2014, Goodman and Decatur actually argued that teaching programming in concert with biological reasoning transforms that code from this mechanical task into a conceptual modeling tool. And other Long and colleagues also found just last year, they emphasized that systems thinking in biology instruction can actually develop these transferable reasoning frameworks. So students learn to make sense of those complex data patterns. They can interpret these emergent patterns and they can then connect these mechanisms across levels of organization, really by embedding these programming aspects within system orientated designs. And by doing this, we can actually help students cultivate not only the technical fluency, but the cognitive flexibility. So it's really about getting them to think differently. And here I've got some images where I'm trying to sort of visualize how the different tools that are present for system thinkers. And we look here just on the left, we've got disconnection, and then we've got some interconnectedness. And, you know, in theory, this makes sense with disconnections where referring to components or elements that exist but are not interacting in your system. So skills are now becoming more and more appropriate, especially with AI. They need to be transferable. So in your system, how might a student identify these isolated components? So my field, we've got separate brain regions, but they come together. And through those interconnected systems, we're able to actually focus on the interactions of how the systems influence each other. So in this sort of very small aspect of this visualization, we can think about interconnected systems that exist within your own disciplines, what that may be, and how could coding illustrate these interactions, or in this case, AI. When we think about linear processes, this occurs in a stepwise, one-directional manner, and processes in the field previously have been quite linear in nature in terms of learning and sort of sharing that data out. But when we think about system thinking, we need feedback loops where we can influence future inputs based on the current output. So are there feedback loops in your system that you could visualize or which could be stimulated by the code? And then when we think about silos and emergence, silos refers to data or components that are separated and analyzed in isolation. So how might siloed thinking limit understanding of systems? And can coding help integrate data across those silos, which brings us on to emergence, which occurs when complex behaviors or properties arise from these interactions of these simple components. So really what we're seeing here is various ways in which we go from independent facts to interconnected reasoning. And that's something that I'm hoping that this visualization can sort of expand upon. And we're seeing that it's not, again, something that's done by trial or error. There is a lot of scientific literacy based on this idea of system thinking and how it supports that transferable thinking, not just in coding, but in other aspects. Which I think could be important and used elsewhere. And it really helps, at least within my courses, integrate biological, computational, and data systems. And it really encourages this coherence across different scales, from the molecular level to the system level, and then its expression at the behavioral level. So there are a couple of designs that we see. This is the types of system mappings. And at the university level, when we're thinking about system level thinking, it really becomes less about the content and mastery and more about that developing adaptive expertise. So this ability to transfer reasoning strategies across new and unfamiliar problems. So we saw some research in 2006 which highlights that learners in higher education benefit more when they engage in representational fluency, that is essentially moving flexibly between the code, data visualizations, conceptual models to explain complex systems. So really, programming serves not as a technical endpoint, but as a cognitive scaffold for integrating these diverse kinds of knowledge that we're seeing. And I previously mentioned some research last year by Long and colleagues, where they really emphasized that the system level thinking, at least their research was with biology educators, they were able to foster a lot of sophistication with students really understanding the science as a network of interacting systems and not linear cause and effect chains that we typically see. So by designing programming exercises intentionally with this idea of cultivating these habits in mind, such as connecting individual data operations to biological interpretations, we can move beyond just simply teaching the code, which now is not possible because we have AI where students can get that code. So we're really trying to nurture this kind of integrative reasoning that really underpins the modern scientific literature, where we're preparing students to reason across scales, across data sets, and across disciplines. So here I've got these four models. This model on the left is behavior over time, which really just involves plotting changes in a system to reveal dynamics. So really, what time-dependent phenomena in your field could track students in terms of the way they're stimulating their code or even using the code. There's the traditional iceberg model that the system has in terms of visible events, which can also help us identify underlying structures, patterns, and mental models. And how can the coding that we're giving to these students help uncover those underlying patterns that aren't immediately observable? And then we've got our causal loop, and that's just a diagram which essentially is highlighting that we need feedback loops between variables. So can students create something which can support their learning later on? And again, I think it's important to use different aspects. You don't need to explicitly use one model. A combination is something that I would recommend. And when we think about systems mapping, everyone really thinks about this connected circle network mapping, where we've got different nodes and their interactions to visualize system connectivity. So really, what this is doing is we're thinking about these cognitive frameworks that are already established in psychology and neuroscience, but we're trying to use that with instructional scaffolding. We're really moving students from this surface learning, which is now becoming more and more of a problem based on AI and generative AI that we use, to really move to that deeper level integration. And I'll talk a bit about the tiered teaching strategy in the next slide, but this should help build that conceptual transfer. And then really making people really think about this idea that programming is a tool for modeling systems, and not these individual concepts that we see in computer science. It's possible to apply it everywhere. So I'm hoping to sort of highlight that you can focus the shift from the learning part to connecting the frameworks. And this supports transferable reasoning across several disciplines. I teach at the interdisciplinary level. So having to cater for students that don't have a strong background in computer science, or the computer science students that don't have a strong background in neuroscience. This is something that, again, encourages metacognition. So students think about their own thinking, essentially. And programming then becomes this cognitive tool for synthesis and not repetition. So if we think about the teaching strategies, I really come to it from a three-pronged approach. So the way I've approached this at the university level is scaffolding system thinking can be implemented effectively through our tiered challenge, which is here on the left-hand side, where students progress from technical execution to integrative reasoning. So this first strategy is scaffolding, and we're doing this through this system tiered challenging. So at level one, we want students to really visualize, at least in terms of neuroscience, we're telling them visualize activation at a single level. So in everyone else's fields, it may be the simplest component at them, which is a basic fact that is known in your field. So in our field, activation can happen in one area. If this is transferred to coding, for instance, we can plot the activation of a brain region. So I'm talking right now, my visual cortex would be active just based on the fact that I'm talking. At level 2, we then want to correlate, read 2 regions and infer communication. So me expecting my visual cortex to be active, my visual cortex to be active if I'm looking at something is known, that's level 1. How can I then relate that to what I'm seeing on the screen? Is another aspect of my brain being active? Am I scared based on what I'm looking at? Is my amygdala active as a result of that? So how can we correlate 2 regions? And again, within your fields, there may be 2 aspects of information that are known. How do we make those 2 relationships? And level 3 is really thinking about the relationships between 3 or more different aspects. And in the case of neuroscience, we can model the entire brain, and then we can discuss those emergent behaviors. In other fields, it can be different. So I previously taught in the Engineering Communication Center, where I would teach technical writing and publication writing to students. So there was a very simple assignment of describing a I got students to describe a process based on a particular machine in engineering, and to ensure students weren't passively writing or looking at content from ChatGPT, I got them to go to the library and develop a 3D model and discuss how the 3D model helped in their ability to discuss the model itself. So instead of it being passive at level 1, where they're describing how a particular machinery works for the purposes of technical communication, they were then able to bring the model in. So we're going from correlating a particular model. So one of the students printed a brain, and they discussed how the 3D model was able to explain that aspect. And level 3 was then, how was this going to be communicated to the rest of to the audience that was listed? In this case, it was a lay member, that being someone who was less than 10 years old. So that was the additional layer. So from this sort of from a pedagogy standpoint, this approach uses zones of proximal development, where we're guiding students from thinking about what they can do independently to what they can do collaboratively and conceptually, thinking about other ways we can scaffold their learning. Given that I teach at the interdisciplinary level, there's a lot of interdisciplinary framing that I do. Before that, what I'm going to do is just ask a quick question in the chat, which is, which levels do you think students reach before they start to lose focus and maybe consult AI? So you can just put in the chat level 1, 2, or 3. But at what point do we think in our courses that's happening? So someone said level 2. Great. Yeah. So we can see a lot of individuals. And are people saying that at level 2 or after level 2? So at level 2, they're comfortable, or as soon as they get to level 2, they're now okay. Yeah. So again, we want to really get them to push past level 2 into level 3, where we're thinking across different domains. And to do that, what we're seeing now is a lot of interdisciplinary framing. We're seeing AI being used, but within the field of sort of, I guess, the pedagogy lens, this really connects to analogical reasoning and a dual coding theory, where we pair abstract syntax or code with familiar processes to strengthen retention and transfer. So we see this in computational neuroscience. Students typically write code out, and it can be code as simple as what's the addition of 2 numbers. We then create a loop. So if we want to add several numbers consistently, these loops would be looping over 2 numbers. So this is iterative in nature. We can then think about how a simple thing such as a loop can be applied not just in computational neuroscience, but to ensure that you're not repeating tasks consistently. So a loop can be used in any field, not just neuroscience itself. So here, this is a little bit more domain specific, but there are different things that I've listed that are not just specific to the field of computational neuroscience. they can be applied to various other life science courses. So really thinking about not just explaining content in terms of this is a loop that minimizes your ability to consistently keep writing out code, but how would this be relevant? Framing different examples, not just within the field itself, I think is really important. And when we see feedback, when we see these loops, we can apply them when we think about system level thinking for things like feedback cycles and how can this be useful in other domains again. These are analogies essentially that we can use that are not domain or discipline specific. And last but not least, I'm a big proponent of using real world context. So I think it's important that students are able to put the content that they're doing. We want to promote transferable problem solving, and we want to situate their knowledge within scientific uncertainty. So a lot of my students use real data, and I use open source data platforms with hundreds and thousands of images so that students can learn, for instance, how to clean this data, how to run network level analysis. And in some of the data I'll show you later on in this talk, you'll see that a lot of students have said that actually visualizing the data, visualizing what they've learned just by looking at the images was able to support their understanding at the systems level. So actually getting them to think more along sort of passive, more past passive interaction has been successful. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about, again, this idea. I've spoken about a couple of different examples, but when we think about something very simple as teaching students how to see the brain as a system, not as a data set, which to some people that may sound abstract in itself, but in my courses, the brain is seen as data. We take the data, we can analyze the data and derive some insight. So when we're thinking about it from a system level standpoint, we want to understand the interactions within a whole rather than studying isolated parts. And this is something that we've seen within the field. Different studies are now focusing on network level activity. My whole thesis was based on interactions within the brain. So in biology, we're moving from this idea of a single neuron to the network, or thinking about one gene to the entire gene expression system. But our teaching doesn't really mirror this. We teach things chronologically, sometimes based on how they've learned. So students may learn certain code snippets, or they may look at certain statistical commands, but they rarely connect all of those aspects to the biological system until the master's or the PhD level. So programming itself can become a vehicle to really teach the system thinking, to help students see feedback, interaction, and emergence in that data. So this aligns with situated cognition, where we're really learning within authentic contexts. And I like to think of this as a cognitive apprenticeship, where you're making expert reasoning visible. And I guess if you were to teach a technical concept such as coding, stats, or a lab technique, how often do students see how it connects to the bigger system or the bigger biological question? So not sure how many people are here in life sciences, but if you feel like, you can put a yes in in the chat if you feel like you see students connecting it to the bigger picture, and you can put a no if you feel like they learn it in isolation. So here I'm trying to get at whether people feel as though students are connecting to the bigger picture more broadly in the courses, or is it just limited to the content? Yeah, so this is typically the case until they get to their thesis. They don't really connect the larger pictures. So what I'm going to do is show two examples. The first example is something to do with gene expression. So to go beyond this idea of neuroimaging, again, computational psychiatry is a very new field, and probably the term hasn't even been coined yet. So we're still at computational neuroscience. But to go beyond that, let's do a gene expression example. So For those that are not from sort of a STEM background, genes, when expressed, result in having various proteins, and these proteins have some sort of expression. Sometimes it can be healthy, other times it can be diseased in nature. So if we think about a scenario, students are given stimulated gene expression data from healthy and diseased tissue, and I am saying to these students, my goal is for them to think about how pandas, which is a coding tool or a coding package, I want them to be able to use this coding package to essentially expand upon this idea that when you express a gene, you can have healthy tissue and you can have diseased tissue. We typically see this in textbooks with the DNA ribose chain, and we'll have some protein image, or you'll have a video where someone is sick visibly, but we don't see this really from a data standpoint. So what I want the students to think here is, how can we reframe the coding as a biological storyteller? So in this case, we can give them the code itself, and we can say, the data is really narrating how the system is shifting and adapting. So when they are able, and probably a lot of people may not know what's going on in this code, and that's totally fine. But when they visualize the image itself, they're able to actually think a bit about what is occurring. So this is a line of inquiry that I would call constructivist, where students are generating meaning through exploration of the data itself, and it's not just replication. So when I'm thinking about how I would get them, to look at code is already daunting. So now with ChatGPT and various other generative AI, code can be placed on the screen to desensitize them. But really, how can we get them to think about questions of a gene that's more upregulated or more expressed, and how is that impacting diseased tissue and healthy tissue? So really getting them to think more and integrating this in our teaching, and how might it impact pathways or feedback loops. So again, thinking about this idea of the different systems of design that we thought about. So I guess I want people to think a bit about what system level questions could you yourself ask your students when they're exploring data, and the data's out there. And now with generative AI, if you can't find that data, it can give you synthetic data so that you can have an example. So this is just a very simple example from sort of genetics and how it can be used to sort of prompt this constructivist inquiry, really getting them to generate meaning through exploration. The second example I want to talk about is more to do with concept maps. So when I teach Introduction to Neuroscience, students are expected to develop their own concept maps about everything that they've learned, but we can also think about that from a code perspective. So students can really build a concept map from their own code outputs. They can link functions, variables, and biological concepts. For example, we've got some code here. This code relates to what's happening in gene A and how that's impacting gene B. And we can get them to think about the conceptual model. So talked a lot about feedback, but visually this may be a little bit easier to grasp this concept where we're going from one variable to another, or one input to an output, and then how are we adjusting this model? So from this sort of standpoint, this tangibly maps reinforcement, right? We're reinforcing metacognition, where students are reflecting not just on what they've coded, but on how coding represents system dynamics. And again, it doesn't necessarily need to be code. You could have two different variables that are affected by each other, but the code could be used as an example of what they need to think about in terms of this conceptual model. So we're getting them, when we're thinking about getting them to do concept maps, we want them to think about it in a way that supports schema integration. So we're turning these discrete facts into a relational understanding. So if I learn in Introductory to Neuroscience that neurons send signals from one aspect of the brain to the other, you can talk a bit about how at the network level, that is really important when we're communicating across several different components, and feedback is necessary for the system to manifest the behavior that is expected as a whole. So when we think about this in terms of the data, what have we seen? So currently teach a course called Big Data Analytics in Neuroscience. So 20 of my students responded. And what I looked at, I asked a series of questions about how coding has integrated coding integration has improved their understanding. So I start off with a lecture component, and then we had some code that they also saw. And I asked them a simple question of whether they felt as if the coding clarified concepts that were introduced, and about over 50% of students actually felt that was indeed the case, and they preferred having the lecture first and then moving to that coding aspect. And 40% of the students felt as though both were necessary, but really, students learn neuroscience more effectively when conceptual explanation was followed by coding applications, at least in this class. And it's a small sample size, and it's a class that I'm doing, so the data may not be generalizable, but just so there is some data to back the facts. Otherwise, I feel like I'd be doing a disservice. The next is visualization. So each of my coding notebooks, I ensure that the students can visualize the brain. They can see the activity, even if it's just a bar graph or a visualization of a change in activity, or how a change in a diseased hippocampus is impacting behavior with someone who has Alzheimer's disease. What we noticed is that visualization was actually one of the strongest bridges to system thinking. Pretty much 90% of students reported that visualizations helped convert the code to biological meaning. The worksheets that I developed, around 70% felt as though the worksheets and the class discussions helped to reinforce that link. And then we had some TA support that allowed them to debug their code when they ran into errors. So here, visualization, at least what I can discern, is that visualization is a primary cognitive scaffold that allows students to move from writing the code to reasoning about brain systems. So this can easily be applied elsewhere. And when we think about this in terms of students shifting to thinking about the brain as a system, what I asked students was, before the course, how many of them thought that coding was just technical in nature, and it's something that comp sci majors do or engineers do, and about I want to say 40 to 70% of them, because I have two sections, reported that they saw programming just as a technical skill. But after the course, what we noticed is around 55% of them said that they now see coding as a way to explore systems. Again, that's not that high, but there was a bit of a shift. And 30% of them said they see it as a bit of both. And last but not least, I also asked the students how they felt when they were applying this content to their final projects, and have they been thinking about it from systems standpoint. And a lot of them actually agreed we had one disagreement and three neutrals, but for the most part, 80% of students agreed that they felt more confident applying this content to real data. And they actually felt like this changed how they understood research. And 70% of them felt like they were more prepared to answer their own research questions. So we're moving away from this sort of singular level thinking to thinking about these system level concepts that I've discussed in class, and then feeling confident to apply it to your own research question. So some of the quantitative aspects that I also was able to discern is they like this idea of sequential learning from that tiered system, where we went from the lecture to the notebook to the project. So really that's mirroring tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, where we're starting simple. In nature, the notebooks introduce those concepts from the lecture with the code, and then the project itself is really where they're picking their own topic of interest and applying it more broadly, and hopefully that develops their confidence. And again, just stated some evidence in the middle column, but really this third column is what I want everyone to, take away from this course. So it really shows that when you think about your course design explicitly from this sort of systems level thinking, there are positive responses. 80% of students reported that seeing the lecture concepts again through the coding notebooks and visualizations helped them understand the brain as a system rather than an isolated part. And nearly all students identified this data visualization as a key step in moving forward from code execution to biological interpretation. So when we think about this, most students really describe that shift from viewing programming as technical in nature or a technical task to really a tool for reasoning about complex systems. So a lot of them felt, at least they reported that they felt that they had a conceptual shift towards this system level thinking. And a lot of them said that they really changed their viewpoint in thinking it was just something technical in nature. And they feel confident. A lot of students really felt like they could now pick a comp sci class if they wanted, or see some data and see some code, and not just because they didn't know all aspects of what the code meant, they could still feel comfortable engaging with some aspect of it. And I did a bit of a thematic analysis with the students, and a lot of students felt as though the course really shifted their understanding in, again, examining these individual networks, but really thinking about it as an entire, individual regions, but thinking about it as an entire network. So really going from level 1 to 2, which is what we wanted. But really, this big takeaway, and this is from the students themselves, they felt as though when they had the blocks of code and then they were asked to modify code, or they were guided through those notebooks, they felt like they were exploring, and as a result had a better understanding, because they weren't just reading and writing or responding to quizzes. They were manually actually engaging with the tasks, and they felt as though they had some part to play with revealing these interactions by, even though they didn't write all the code, just by adjusting a few parameters and playing about with the visualizations, they felt comfortable. So one of the key patterns was that even students who did not identify a new project, they still reported thinking about more interactions between regions rather than these isolated areas. And again, this idea of thinking beyond one isolated component is this idea of systems thinking. And lastly, students then said that they had some reflection statements, and a few of them mentioned that they now see neuroscience not just as a singular neuron or an animal study in one animal or a few animals, but they now could see it in a different from a different standpoint, with networks and pathways, interaction and connectivity. And it's not just a static neuron that has sent a signal from one place to another. And they again felt like they had some meaningful understanding of relationships in the brain, which again is something that we're also not seeing within the field of neuroscience. It's still very singular in nature. So it was great to really see that there was a consistent shift across students, seeing, again, coding from a technical task to a way of thinking. And many of them said that the coding made sense once they could visualize and interpret the biological meaning. So in the slide prior, this seems very daunting, but if we have a visualization of the brain, which may relate to how different areas connect, this makes the code a little bit more accessible in nature. So a lot of students had a similar concept, and one of the things that I felt most students essentially were saying was that the programming helped them think about the dynamic interaction. So this is something that I've been trying to see if this would work, and at least in this course, it was something that was pretty useful. So how could you think about this question in terms of your own work? So I usually ask students, when we think about it, how do we really teach students that the brain is not just a data set? I hope through sort of the examples that I've shown that it is possible to foster this. And again, one of the visualizations that I showed them through the code was something very simple in nature. And I got them to think a bit about that system level thinking, right? What are the links between these structures and functions? So I always say it's great to start with a visualization that can summarize everything. And I work with neuroimaging data. So it was great for me because pretty images always help students in tandem with the programming itself. So I hope that I was able to kind of make everyone at least feel as though programming is not just about the syntax, but we can model behavior. And if you scan this QR code has a list of vocabulary and a couple of definitions on the different things I've discussed in relation to the tools for system thinking and also for designing system thinking. So those types of system thinking models that I discussed earlier. But really what I want people to really think about is how can programming help students understand interactions in the brain, at least for me. So I'd want you to change the word brain for yourself and add what it may be in your own research. So I know I've got a couple of minutes or maybe two. But essentially what I want to sort of end with is this idea that programming could be a great lens for system thinking. And it's more than syntax, it's more than the code that, generative AI can spit out. We really can connect across different disciplines and within the same discipline. And it can be used as a scaffolding technique where we're starting from these simple ideas to complex tasks. And at least in my field of interdisciplinary work, I feel like it's important for framing these ideas and being able to apply that to their own data, which is why I think real world context also matters. But to end, I think that system thinking, since system level thinking is a generalizable strategy, which can be applied not just in neuroscience education, but elsewhere, and really to get students to think more about this interaction, not just in terms of network, but generally as a whole. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rosie. Trisha put the survey link in there, so please go ahead and take the survey. Anybody have any questions? I will say, as someone who comes from a very different background in that I'm an educator, the all of the talk of coding and how our brain works is fascinating to me and not something I know how to. Obviously, I'm not a coder. I do not know how to code. But what really intrigued me were the words that you threw in talking about your practice, like zone of proximal development, instructional scaffolding, situated thinking, constructivist inquiry, transferring resources across disciplines, metacognition. All of those things are things we teach educators how to do with their students. And so to me, it was like a case study in listening to you as an educator talk about what you're doing within your field, which was absolutely fascinating to me. So thank you for sharing this with us and also sharing. We hear a lot of doom and gloom about AI and how, it's taking over the world, it's going to knock us out of our jobs, all this thing, but showing us how AI really is useful for people to see system thinking and how things work across disciplines. You don't need to know how to code to understand what the code is doing and how it connects to other things. So that was intriguing to me.
I'm glad.
All right. Well, I don't see any questions in the chat. Oh, yes. Thank you, Becky. The instructional design lens coming from Becky in the chat as well.
Yes, I've been trying to make changes that are grounded in some level of research. And as a teaching professor, we don't get much research focus. So I've been looking at sort of the pedagogy and the research into sort of effective ways to teach. So it's been interesting to see that there are things out there that can help students.
Well, great. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone. And with that, we'll bring our session to a close.